I hope that by dropping these names I can convey something of the headiness of it. It might have been heady at any time, but in the 68 atmosphere it chanced to coincide with other ferments and intoxications as well. It's trite to say that each generation rebels, and I'd already had the chance to get bored with the late 50s image of a rebel without a cause. But it so fell out that we, the so-called boomers, or at least the 68 portion of us, were rebels with a cause. Thus it happened that one evening in the Oxford Union dining room, when I was still not yet 20 and perhaps not even 19, I acted as host to Isaiah Berlin, our guest as an invited speaker on the subject of his very first published book, The Life and Thought of Karl Marx. The sponsor was the Oxford University Labour Club, which had not yet irretrievably split between the Socialists and the Social Democrats, and I had been listed on the club's card as secretary, Chris Hitchens, Bow. This rankled twice. Even the name of my ancient college Balliol had been pruned and cut back. Still, not much could spoil an evening where one was hosting an eyewitness of the Bolshevik Revolution in St. Petersburg. Still, the only such person I've ever met. I have to say that the evening was two kinds of shock to me. In the first place, Berlin's urbanity and magnetism were like nothing I'd ever met before, and vindicated, I remember thinking, the whole point of coming to Oxford in the first place. Cured me for life, he murmured authoritatively, about the experience of seeing a communist revolution at first hand. Having had every opportunity to grow weary of undergraduate naivety and or enthusiasm, he betrayed no sign of it, and managed to answer questions as if they were being put to him for the first time. This I understood as a great gift without being able to define it, just as I, who knew nothing of food or wine, somehow understood that the dinner we were offering him, a strain on our fiercely straitened socialist budget, was far inferior to the average he could have expected if dining at home or in college, or indeed alone. I was later to find that George Orwell, invited by Philip Larkin in 1941 to address a joint meeting of the Labour Club and the English Club, had been given an inedible dinner because Larkin had earlier splurged all the hospitality fund on an ill-advised blowout for Dylan Thomas. The second shock came when we moved to the seminar room for the talk itself. Though he spoke with his customary plummy authority, and leavened this with a good deal of irony and wit, Berlin clearly didn't know very much either about Marx or Marxism. He woodenly maintained that Marx was a historical determinist. It's true that the old boy sometimes spoke of history itself as an actor, but he actually stressed human agency more than almost any other thinker. It came to me later as quite a confirmation to read in Berlin's biography that he had been commissioned to write a quickie book on Marx, and had told the publishers how unqualified he felt to do it. This was another aspect of his famous insecurity about his own golden reputation, a self-doubt that he could never get his many disciples to take seriously. But at the time I was marooned between two almost equally subversive and exciting thoughts. Was it possible that the class of celebrated experts were all like this? That there was an academic kingdom of Oz where it was only pretended that the authorities were absolute? Or was I putting on airs and presuming to judge my betters? His very name seemed to exude authority. Old Testament conjoined to the brilliant but haunted capital. The only rival in nomenclature I can call to mind is my friend Pascal Bruckner. At the somewhat later cocktail party in Beaumont Street, Berlin again lived up to his billing by first remembering my name and the circumstances under which we had met, and second, remembering that I'd said that his talk had made my own Marxism a little more self-confident, and third, ignoring much more distinguished figures who wanted his company, and telling me quite a long story about Henry James and Winston Churchill. Having told you that much, how can I avoid retelling it to you? It seems that in the early days of the First World War, both James and Churchill had been invited to a lunch party near one of the Channel ports. James presumably because he lived at Rye, and Churchill because he was running the Admiralty. James was all enthusiasm, having applied to become a British citizen, and flushed with the zeal of the convert. Churchill, however, had no time for the old man's eager questions about the progress of the war, and rather snubbed him. When the coming statesman had left in his chauffeur-driven car to go back to London, the rest of the company turned to Henry James to see if he could be cheered up after being so crushed. But he brightened on his own account and said, "It is strange with how, on even a hand, nature chooses to distribute her richest favours," going on to add, "but it rather bucks one up." In that way that was so characteristic of him, Berlin went on to repeat, "Rather bucks one up, couple of times. I had had a frisson of another sort when seated in a small Nuffield seminar room with Noam Chomsky. Having attended those John Locke lectures in which he had galvanized the university by insisting on delivering one of the series solely on the question of Vietnam, I knew that he was a highly potent scholar and speaker. A large number of leftists in those days suddenly discovered a consuming interest in linguistics and the deep structures of generative grammar. But up close I realized that there was something toneless about him, something indeed almost mechanical, as if he were afraid to show any engagement with the emotions. He wasted, I remember, a huge amount of time on a banal question about the American Maoist sect Progressive Labor. Through this and other experiences, I began to discern one of the elements of an education. Get as near to the supposed masters and commanders as you can and see what stuff they're really made of. As I watched famous scholars and professors flounder here and there, I also, in my career as a speaker at the Oxford Union, had a chance to meet senior ministers and parliamentarians up close and dine with them before as well as drink with them afterwards, and be amazed once again at how ignorant and sometimes plain stupid were the people who claimed to run the country. This was an essential stage of my formation, and one for which I'm hugely grateful, though I fear it must have made me much more insufferably cocky and sure of myself than I deserved to be. A consciousness of rectitude can be a terrible thing, and in those days I didn't just think I was right. I thought that we, our group of international socialists in particular, were being damn well proved right. If you have never yourself had the experience of feeling that you are yoked to the great steam engine of history, then allow me to inform you that the conviction is a very intoxicating one. In the early spring of 1968, we saw the valiant guerrillas of the Viet Cong carrying their fight to the very doorstep of the American embassy in Saigon. Not long after came the never-to-be-forgotten shots of the Capitol in Washington, shrouded in plumes of smoke and flame, as Black America refused to sit still for the murder of the gentle Martin Luther King. In Poland, a so-called anti-Zionist purge proved that the Stalinist gerontocrats would stoop even to Hitlerite tactics to repress dissent and prolong their sterile and boring hold on power. The year began to gather pace and acquire a rhythm. In late April, on Hitler's birthday to be precise, Enoch Powell appeared to insult the memory of Dr. King by making a speech warning that coloured immigration in Britain would eventuate in bloodshed. He succeeded, at any rate, in igniting a bonfire of rubbishy racism among many elements of the British working class. A few weeks later, the French working class appeared to make a completely different point by joining a revolt against 10 years of Gaullism that had originally begun among Parisian students, and by not merely going on strike, but occupying the factories that warehoused them for the working day. Many of the Paris 68 slogans struck my cohort as absurd or quixotic or narcissistic. Take Your Desires for Reality was one especially silly one, but I shall never forget how the workers at the Berlier factory rearranged the big letters of the company's name to read Liberté right over the factory gate. Suddenly it did truly seem possible that the revolutionary tradition of Europe was being revived. How was I to know that I was watching the end of a tradition rather than the resurrection of one? I kept that transistor radio by my bed, and almost every morning I would reach out and turn it on and be forced out of bed by some fresh crisis. Bobby Kennedy slain, the implosion of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, the mass mobilizations of American youth against the draft. When I was 18 and 19 and 20, there was no 18-year-old franchise, and the single deadliest and most telling line of Barry Maguire's then-famous song, Eve of Destruction, was, "You're old enough to kill, but not for voting." It's sobering and depressing to reflect that Maguire, who'd mainly been influenced by the war in the Middle East the preceding year, is now one of those bards who still likes to sing about the end of days, because he is a millennialist and fundamentalist Christian. But by then, I had come to prefer even the hardline militant verses of Phil Oakes to the more lenient Bob Dylan. One was, to a certain degree, compelled to think in generational terms, and in these terms my whole arrival at Balliol, an outcome for which I had worked so hard for so long, had been a disappointment. There were still petty rules and regulations covering one's movements, still a curfew by which time the college gate was locked, and all female guests had to be out of one's room, still instructions about what to wear, and still the impression that one's new dons, like one's former teachers, were in loco parentis, or surrogate parents or guardians. In time, my generation was to change a lot of that too. But we of the International Socialists thought that such alterations were incidental, indeed almost irrelevant when contrasted to the global struggle of which we quite genuinely believed ourselves to be a part. Let me give an example. I would once have said, let me give a concrete example. For some time, there had been mounting reports of a rising in Africa against Portuguese colonialism. The senescent dictator, Antonio Salazar, a dirty relic from the era of Mussolini and Hitler, held the people of Portugal itself in bondage, but also counted among his possessions the territories of Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Angola and Mozambique, if you glance at a map, are like pillars or gates guarding the eastern and western approaches to Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, and South Africa. Thus it seemed fairly obvious that a victory against Portuguese fascism would also spell the end, in not too much time, of apartheid. Picture then my pride and excitement when it was announced that Dr. Eduardo Mondlane, the founder of the Mozambican movement Frelimo, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, would be in England and had accepted an invitation from our modest little Labour Club to come and speak. We booked a big hall for him and a very small room, my own, inside the college because our resources were exhausted, for a reception. Both events were full, and I shall not forget the immense pride with which I opened my door to this genial and eloquent and brave and modest man. In my lodgings that evening, as I think back on it, the guests, among them Robert Rescher, representative in London of Mandela's African National Congress, included the spokesmen for several movements that were later to become governments. After Mondlane's rafter-ringing speech, through which Michael Prest sat by the door determinedly holding a stout and sharp umbrella in case any local fascists tried any rough stuff, we all marched in torchlight procession to lay a wreath for those who had died to free their country. A few weeks later, Dr. Mondlane opened a parcel in his office in Tanzania and was murdered by an explosive charge that had been sent to him by the Portuguese secret police. I have since laid another wreath on his grave in a free Mozambique. I can't be as proud now as I was then of also hosting Nathan Chamurira, a spokesman for the black majority in White Rhodesia, for whom we arranged a meeting in the precincts of Rhodes House itself, one of the great imperialists' many endowments to Oxford. He spoke persuasively enough, but the next time I saw him in the flesh he was a minister in Robert Mugabe's unspeakable government. However, and in compensation, I can say that Nelson Mandela, then only at the beginning of his almost 3 decades of imprisonment, was made an honorary vice president of the Labour Club and had his name put on our membership cards. We wrote to him on Robben Island to inform him of this honour. Decades later, when I met him at the British ambassador's house in Washington, I rather absurdly asked him if he had ever received the letter. With that room-warming smile of his, he replied that he had indeed received it, and that he remembered it brightening his day. I didn't really believe this charming pretense, but I did become voiceless for a minute or so. Just as Oxford allowed one to meet near-legendary members of the establishment's firmament on nearly equal terms, so it enabled encounters with celebrated academic dissidents. One of the achievements of our year was to bring the students of Ruskin College, the Labour Movement Institute for Scholarship-Minded Workers, into the argument. All right, not to bring them, but to help them bridge the gap by, for example, demanding that they be made eligible to join the Oxford Union. At gatherings of the History Workshop, held on Ruskin's grounds and in nearby alehouses, I heard E.P. Thompson deliver an impromptu lecture on the enclosures of common land in the 18th and 19th centuries, in which he brought an otherwise unsentimental audience to tears with his recitation of the poems of John Clare. The gentle and humane spirit of the late Raphael Samuel was the animating force in this higher education. His democratic energy was boundless, and his meek, modest appearance always made him a special target for the rough attentions of the police. I can still see him being rudely shoved into a cell, where I and others were already penned after a demonstration, his spectacles deliberately broken and his face and hands cut and bruised, for all the world like some luckless Jewish scholar who'd been made a plaything by the brown comedians on Kristallnacht. Taking his seat on the bare floor and looking myopically and cheerfully about himself, he reconvened the last session of the History Workshop and made us all recollect how even Edward Thompson had left a few things out of the account. Nowadays, the very word workshop is an intimation to me of boredom and dogma, and I shall never forget Raphael's honesty when he finally wrote in the 1980s that he didn't really desire to live in a socialist society, but his theatres of memory is still a potent and eloquent reminder of a braver time, the recollection of which I don't have the right to deny. All this was very much a part of the Chris half of my existence. The Chris who wore a donkey jacket and got himself beaten up by scabs in a punch-up on the picket line at French and Collett's non-union auto parts factory. Fenton swears that I even donned a beret to lead a demonstration. He's quite incapable of an untruth, but I'm sure I didn't do it more than once. This was all in a day's work, a day that might include leafleting or selling the socialist worker outside a car plant in the morning, then spray-painting pro-Viet Cong graffiti on the walls, and arguing vehemently with communists and social democrats or rival groups of Trotskyists long into the night. These latter battles were by far the most bitter and strenuous ones, and they often involved disputes that would have seemed ridiculously arcane to the outsider, as to whether the Soviet system was a deformed or degenerated workers' state, for example, as opposed to our indictment of it as state capitalist. However, a training in logic chopping and Talmudic-style micro-exegesis can come in handy in later life, as can a training in speaking with a bullhorn from an upturned milk crate outside a factory, and then later scrambling into a dinner jacket and addressing the Oxford Union Debating Society under the rules of parliamentary order. That last example was an instance of the Christopher side. It was through the Union, in fact, that I found myself becoming socially involved with an altogether different set. These were confident young men who owned fast cars, who had rooms rather than a room, who wore waistcoats and cravats and drank wine and liqueurs instead of beer. After I'd made some successful sally or other in a union debate, a group of these closed in on me as the proceedings were ending, and more or less challenged me to come and have a cocktail. I couldn't resist, anyway, I didn't want to. Here, I thought, might be the entree to that more gorgeous and seductive Oxford, of which I'd read so much and thus far experienced so little. Thereby, and perhaps not quite unlike poor, dowdy Charles Ryder in War's masterpiece, I found myself from time to time transported into the world of Christchurch and the Gridiron Club, and invited to dine in restaurants which featured tasselled menus and wine lists. This was wholly new to me and potentially very embarrassing too, since I had virtually no money. The commander, when I turned 18, had taken me to the bank, opened an account in my name with £50 in it, and told me, in effect, that that was my lot. However, without a word actually being spoken, it was subtly conveyed to me by my new friends that I wasn't expected to reciprocate. I was, instead, expected to sing for my supper. This could have been corrupting, but I justified it to myself by saying that I was learning from and perhaps even teaching the enemy camp. In the late 60s, it wasn't only we who thought there might be a revolution round the corner. Quite a good portion of the establishment was fairly rattled and apprehensive also. And the Tory press was full of material which, because it tended to exaggerate our influence and numbers, made those of us on the hard left feel that perhaps we weren't wasting our time. The university authorities at one time seriously considered paving over the cobblestones in some of Oxford's older streets, lest they be dug up and employed as missiles, as had occurred in Paris. In case I may seem too opportunistic, let me say that I genuinely came to like some of these gilded and witty reactionaries. One of them, the late David Levy, later quite a celebrated conservative intellectual, was certainly the first proto-fascist I'd ever met, and I would often almost literally pinch myself as he burbled gaily on about Charles Maurras and Action Française, about the beauties of Salazar's Portugal and Franco's Spain, and sang the words of the Mussolini anthem Giovinezza. Gaily might chance to be the apt expression here because there was a good deal of camp among these young men, and a certain amount of active bisexuality, though I don't think David himself ever even looked at a woman. It makes me blush a bit to say so, but I was still prized for my looks in those days, and from experience at my own much less glamorous boarding school, could read the signs and knew the ropes. Every now and then, even though I was by then fixed on the pursuit of young women, a mild and mildly enjoyable relapse would occur, and I suppose I can claim this, if that's the right word, of two young men who later became members of Margaret Thatcher's government. For this reason I can't really give any more names, but one oblique consequence was that I got myself invited to meet John Sparrow at All Souls. How to describe the warden, as he was universally known, and how to describe his college, a florid antique shop that admitted no students and guarded only the exalted privileges of its fellows, a den of iniquity to every egalitarian, and a place where silver candelabras and goblets adorned a nightly debauch of venison and port. Or so the tales ran. It was in this thick, rich atmosphere that the Munich Agreement had partly been hatched. There was a whole book, with the simple, damning title, All Souls and Appeasement. I absolutely could not wait to see the place for myself. It was by no means a disappointment. Sparrow was hosting a small luncheon might have been more than mot juste, and as he took my hand with both of his, he summoned a butler named Lane to inquire what I might desire by way of a drink. I had never seen a butler before, and this one had the same name as Algy's manservant in the importance of being earnest. I had barely had time to adjust myself when lunch began, and I was overwhelmed by the variety and deliciousness of the food and wine, and the splendour of the silver and glass. Sparrow exerted himself to live up to everything one had ever heard about him. He declared that homosexuality ought to be punishable, gravely punishable, as he put it, with purring relish, even though he hoped to remain a member of a sophisticated minority that would be exempt from this very code. Since the law had only recently been changed, I recall myself guessing that there was an element of masochistic nostalgia in this. Sparrow had evidently done some hard thinking about buggery. He had contributed to the last great argument about literary censorship in England, arguing that in a very rugged passage of Lady Chatterley's Lover, D.H. Lawrence had plainly intended to suggest that the gamekeeper had sodomized his boss's wife. I must say that I agree with this analysis, though what struck me most about the novel when I last read it was the way in which gruff Nottinghamshire miners say axe for ask, in just the same manner that now marks off the speech of the black American ghetto. Some work here surely for a philologist, but not a project that would have especially amused Sparrow. Like Lord Marchmain in Brideshead, Sparrow was everything that the socialists would have me be. His reactionary style was almost, if not in fact, a self-parody. He had engaged a photographer to walk around Oxford and take discreet photographs, not of the most beautiful and epicene young men, but of the most scrofulous and surly ones. This might have betrayed an interest in rough trade and was perhaps not unconnected to it, but when he showed me the resulting album, which contained snatched studies of quite a few of my more disaffected friends, he accompanied my turning of the pages with a reading of Walter Pater on the ephemerality and fragility of youth. I was by then a dinner guest, and even an after-dinner guest, over the candles and decanters as they reflected each other in the high polish of the table. One evening I was placed next to that great Cornish queen, A.L. Rouse, who'd only recently unburdened himself of a new gay theory of the origin and dedication of Shakespeare's sonnets, but mainly wanted to tell me what I already knew, that Hitchens was a Cornish name, and positively demanded to be told whether the Mrs. Hitchens, who kept sending him such fervent and unwanted love letters, was by any chance my mother. He was so lost in conceit that he did not, I remember thinking, completely trust my denial. For all who try to lead a double life, there will eventually be a small but interesting revenge, as James Fenton later phrased it to me. Mine came when I was addressing a crowd of infuriated students from the steps of the Clarendon Building and denouncing some official infraction of our rights to free sex and free association and free speech. Over the heads of the audience, as I was hitting my peroration, I saw the silvered and saturnine features of the warden, who must by then have been the most execrated figure on the Oxford left. A twitch at the corner of his lip betrayed his design, which I detected almost at the same instant. Making a discreet but determined path through the astonished protesters, he arrived just as I was concluding, and said, "My dear Christopher, I'm so sorry to have missed most of your speech. I've no doubt it was admirable, but I do hope you haven't forgotten that you promised to look in after dinner tonight." It was a moment of cockcrow. I could have pretended not to understand, but I replied instead that I was looking forward to it, and, as he glided away with the sleek air of game, set and match clinging to him, faced the slightly baffled faces of my comrades. I could have taken refuge in some know-your-enemy formulation, but something in me said that this would be ignoble. I didn't want a one-dimensional politicized life. I sympathized all the same with those who were effectively forced to live one. Again, to cite James Fenton, who first pointed it out to me, you were compelled to notice something different about the American students. As the rest of us poured out of hall after dinner and had a smoke and a drink in the quad, they tended to draw aside and form a huddle as if hashing over some private matter or specific grief. We all knew what this was. Having been lucky enough to become Rhodes Scholars, or in other ways be chosen as envoys of their country, They found themselves overseas at a time when the United States was conducting an imperialist war in Indochina and a holding action against the insistent demands of its own long-oppressed black minority at home. These things would have been bad enough by themselves, but in addition it was entirely possible that these young Americans could be compelled to take part in a war they mostly regarded as criminal. Hence those tight little circles on the lawn as the Oxford dusk came on. Should they defy the draft and become outlaws with the choice of prison or exile, or submit and become obedient and get on with their careers? It's been often said since that it was only the military draft that stoked anti-war feeling among the relatively privileged American students, and that once the system of conscription was abolished, the feeling of outrage about Vietnam was diminished in proportion. I was there, and I remember clearly, and I feel it a point of honour to give the lie to this sneer. The young Americans I knew were not afraid of being killed, or rather, they were very much more afraid that they would be forced to kill. I would never have guessed at the time that conscription would be abolished by Richard Nixon, and still less that he would appoint Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan to the Presidential Commission on the subject. The two right-wing libertarians condemned the draft as involuntary servitude. Today, almost the only people who call for the return of the system are collectivists and liberals. I remember the address, 46 Leckford Road, where many of them shared a house. Frank Aller, for example, a brilliant and conscience-ridden young man, eventually took his own life because he could not bear the conflict between his love of his country and his hatred of the war. Another young man lodging at the same address was Bill Clinton. I don't recollect him so well, though my friend and contemporary Martin Walker, later to be one of Clinton's best biographers, swears that he remembers us being in the same room. The occasion was to become a famous one, since it was the very time when the habitual and professional liar Clinton later claimed that he didn't inhale. There's no mystery about this any more than there ever was about his later falsifications. He has always been allergic to smoke, and he preferred, like many another marijuana enthusiast, to take his dope in the form of large handfuls of cookies and brownies. Distributed around Oxford at the time were many young men, Strobe Talbot, Robert Reich, Ira Magaziner, who were later to become members of the Clinton administration. Of these I remember Magaziner, later the man to ruin American healthcare on behalf of Hillary Clinton, the best. He had been something of a leader of the anti-war movement at Brown University in Rhode Island. I had written "Ring Ira" on a pad by the telephone in a house I was then sharing, and when the police came calling on another matter, to do with a public demonstration, they took a lot of persuading that this was not a sinister appointment with Irish republicanism. I didn't much like what little I knew of Clinton, and this may have had something to do with my suspicion that he too was trying to have things both ways. Someone was informing on the American anti-war students and reporting their activities to Mr. Cordmeyer and the CIA desk at the London Embassy in Grosvenor Square. We knew this because the fools once approached the wrong guy as a recruit and he blew the whistle. And I'm not the only person who has sometimes suspected that it was Clinton who was the snitch. On another face-both-ways question, he and I both became peripherally involved, at different times I hasten to add, with a pair of Leckford Road girls who, principally sapphic in their interests, would arrange for sessions of group frolic. The men who flattered themselves that they were the desired objective would later discover that they were merely the goats tethered in the clearing, the better to magnetize more women into the trap. I have always thought that to be a deft and sinuous scheme, and wish that I had understood its dynamics better at the time. But this is very much like the rest of life, where, as Kierkegaard so shrewdly observes, one is condemned to live it forward and review it backward. If you're going to sleep with Thatcher's future ministers and toy with a future president's lesbian girlfriend, in other words, you will not be able to savour it fully at the time, and will have to content yourself with recollecting it in some kind of tranquillity. I tried at the time, and have even attempted retrospectively, to pretend that I enjoyed Oxford more than I did. For example, my tutor in formal logic was Dr. Anthony Kenny, who was only then beginning to raise the vast architecture of his now magisterial History of Philosophy. Descending the staircase from his room after a tutorial, I remember thinking that I had finally lodged in my mind the principles of Cartesian reasoning. Kenny had been a Catholic priest in a tough district of Liverpool before deciding that Thomas Aquinas' proofs of God's existence were unsatisfactory. He left the ministry and quite some time later got married, at which point the Catholic Church excommunicated him because he had violated his vows as a priest. Many people don't understand that the term lapsed Catholic entails the sinister implication that only the Church can decide who leaves it and why or when. I had already come across some extreme communist sects which would insist on expelling anyone who wished to resign. Anyway, on the evening of my Cartesian tutorial, I sat in my room listening to all the bells of Oxford chiming and tolling and telling myself, here you are, in a college that has been a great centre of learning since the medieval schoolmen. Outside your window is the very place where Bishops Cranmer and Latimer and Ridley were burned at the stake for their principles. You can be the inheritor of all this and more and give yourself to the life of the mind. Even as I tried to convince myself, I realized what I have often had to accept since, that if you have to try and persuade yourself of something, you are probably already very much inclined to doubt or distrust it. Did I really think that my examinations in logic and philosophy didn't matter much because a revolution was in progress, or at least in prospect? I did. Did I ignore my parents and my tutors when they said that my career prospects would suffer unless I applied myself more to my studies? Yes, again, and not so much with careless abandon as with the thought that such counter-inducements were somehow contemptible. Did I go to a vast demonstration in Grosvenor Square in London, outside the American Embassy, which turned into a pitched battle between ourselves and the mounted police, and wonder in advance how many people might actually be killed in such a confrontation? Yes, I did. And I can still recall the way in which my throat and heart seemed to swell as the police were temporarily driven back and the advancing allies of the Vietnamese began to sing "We Shall Overcome." I added to my police record for arrests, of all of which I am still reasonably proud. When a charge against me of incitement to riot was eventually dropped, I was slightly crestfallen because I had thought it a backhanded tribute to my abilities as an orator. I helped organise a sit-down outside an Oxford hairdresser's shop that refused black female customers. While still on bail for this pending offence, I sat down again on the pitch at a cricket match involving a segregated South African team. In court I failed to amuse the magistrate when I complained of the brutal behaviour of the arresting police officer and gave the number that he'd worn on his uniform. "How can you be so sure," snapped the man on the judicial bench, "of that number?" "Merely because, Your Honour," I responded sarcastically, "the figures 1389 are the same as the date of the Great Peasants' Revolt." The resulting heavy fine reflected the court's view of my impromptu contempt, as well as of my refusal to swear on the Bible when I took my oath. When found guilty, my comrades and I rose to our feet in the dock and sang the International, fists raised in the approved and defiant manner. I didn't have the money to pay the fine, but I had been told that there was every chance that John Lennon would shell out for all of us. I later vastly preferred Mick Jagger's Street Fighting Man, which had been written for my then-friend Tariq Ali, to the Beatles' more conciliatory "You Say You Want a Revolution," but in those days I would also have agreed with one of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's favourite statements, borrowed as I now know from the satirical Juvenal, that pecunia non olet, or money has no smell. Anyway, I left the court in a hurry because on the following day I was due to board a charter flight that would take me across the Atlantic for the first time in my life and land me in revolutionary Cuba. Havana versus Prague. Within the revolution, everything. Outside the revolution, nothing. Fidel Castro. Ex ecclesia nulla salus. Outside the church, no salvation. Thomas Aquinas. At the risk of seeming ridiculous, the true revolutionary is moved by true feelings of love. Ernesto Che Guevara. Socialism with a Human Face. Alexander Dubček. The expedition to Cuba was the toughest exercise in double accounting that I had so far undertaken. It was only a few months since Guevara had met his pathetic yet stirring demise in the highlands of Bolivia, and the Cuban government had announced that any young leftist who wanted to break the embargo and could get to the island would be a guest in a special camp for internationalists. This, with its chance to mingle with the revolutionaries from all over the globe, was an unmissable invitation. But it was also an opportunity to see whether Cuba's claim to be an alternative model to Soviet state socialism possessed any staying power. It's difficult to remember today when Havana itself is run by a wrinkled oligarchy of old communist gargoyles, but in the 1960s there was a dramatic contrast between the waxworks in the Kremlin and the young, informal, spontaneous, and even somewhat sexy leadership in Havana. Not that we of the International Socialists, who sent our own team of polemicists and dialecticians to the camp, were much impressed by beard-sporting histrionic types either. It was revolution within the revolution again. Since I couldn't pay that fine, how had I paid for the flight? Easy. I had just been awarded a Kitchener Scholarship, named for the man whose face adorned the World War I poster, admonishing all young Britons to remember that your country needs you. Available only to the sons of naval and military officers who were obliged to lead low-budget lives at university, this award required an interview with some red-faced old buffers who wanted mainly to reassure themselves about one's general soundness. I had a decent shave and put on a tie and played along. When asked what I did for extracurricular activity, I cited the Oxford Union. "Didn't Her Majesty the Queen," one of the whiskery veterans inquired, "just recently attend a debate there?" This was too good to miss. She had, in fact, shown up, and I had been technically a member of the committee that ran the debate. Modestly, I made the most of this fact and knew in that moment that the scholarship named for the red-coated imperial hero of Khartoum would be mine and would help finance a socialist incendiary. I think I may also have justified my duplicity by recalling the shameful way in which the Navy had treated my father over his pension. Yes, that's right, they owe us. What great self-persuaders we all are. At Gatwick Airport I recognised quite a few of the brothers and sisters who turned up to board the scruffy Czechoslovak charter aircraft that was to take us to Havana, and I submitted sullenly to the business of being pulled to one side while plainclothes British policemen rudely grabbed my passport and wrote down all my details in a ledger before letting me proceed. Who cares, I thought angrily. Their rule won't last much longer. The belly of the beast was the expression commonly used for the United States in those days, and there seemed something gratifying in the way that our plane made only a brief touchdown in Newfoundland before embarking upon the second leg and setting course for Havana while avoiding the taint of Yankee airspace. Arrival at the Jose Marti airport, with its blinding sunshine and crushing humidity, was an excitement all of its own. We were greeted by smiling and good-looking young comrades who offered a tray of daiquiri rum cocktails. This first impression was as unlike the Berlin Wall version of official communism as one could wish. But there came at once a slight moment of awkwardness. After handing over my passport, I waited a while and, having by now heard a couple of rousing speeches of welcome, asked for it back. The hospitable internationalist grin on the face of the Cuban host contracted perhaps a millimetre or so. "We look after it for you." "You do? For how long?" "Until you leave our country." I felt an immediate sense of unease, but decided to get over it. I might perhaps have succeeded in getting over it, were it not for a couple of later developments. The scheme was for our plane load of mainly British internationalists to board the waiting buses that would take us to the Campamento Cinco de Mayo, a newly built work camp in the hilly, verdant province of Pinar del Rio. Here we would join our French, German, Italian, African, and other compañeros and have dialogues with them in the evening while helping to plant much-needed coffee seedlings during the day. In this fashion we would build links between different insurgencies at the grassroots level while, at the seedling level, helping to rid Cuba of its notorious colonial dependency on the single crop, the infamous monoculture, of sugar. What could be more agreeable? Not unlike the state of Kentucky, which subsists on bourbon, gambling, and tobacco, Cuba's economy rested almost entirely on the manufacture of agreeable toxins like rum and cigars. But even then, its chief export was its own citizens. When I returned to Cuba some years later, there was no trace to be found of the coffee plantation, and, in the era of Gorbachev's perestroika, which Castro was resisting, about a 50-50 chance of getting a cup of actual coffee, even in a Havana hotel. I didn't expect or want luxury at the camp, and I didn't get it. Canvas bunk beds, very early starts, communal showers and meals. These were no sweat and no problem for one who had survived English public school, whereas, in contrast to my boarding school experience, the food was excellent and plentiful, and there were females with red scarves in their hair. I didn't especially like the way that uplifting music and hectoring speeches were played all the time on the camp's loudspeaker system, but I was much more alarmed when, deciding on a hike one day to enjoy the surrounding scenery, I began to wave goodbye to the Cuban boys at the gate and was ordered to hold it right there. Where did I think I was going? On a hike. Well, I was told I couldn't. And why not? Because we say so. Now, I didn't speak much Spanish, and I didn't have a passport, it suddenly came back to me. And I would have had only a vague idea how to negotiate my way to a neighbouring village, let alone to Havana. But the guards, as I now thought of them, pointed emphatically back up the trail to the camp. Once you have been told that you can't leave a place, Its attractions may be many, but its charm will instantly be void. A cat may stay contentedly in one spot for hours at a time, but detain it in that spot by grasping its tail, and it will try to tear out its own tail by the roots. I wasn't free to move at all, and the Cubans who wanted to leave Cuba were only free, after a long process, to be expelled from their country of birth and never allowed to return. Naturally, this qualified my attitude to the camp itself, but then I had come with my fellow Trotskyists and Luxemburgists precisely to test the Cuban claim that this was a new revolution, a brave departure from the grim grey pattern of Soviet socialism. Also, it had to be admitted, Cuba was helping the many rebel forces that were even then fighting so bravely on a Latin American continent that was dominated by cruel and backward military dictatorships. Factional arguments in the camp kept us joyously and passionately awake. Of course, we argued about everything from the Spanish Civil War to the Paris Commune, but two critical questions were these. Had Che Guevara been right in proposing that moral incentives should replace material ones? And what line should be taken about the increasingly bitter split between the Russian and Czechoslovakian communist parties? On the question of moral incentives and the idea of the new socialist man, I had nothing but doubts. At the close of his beautiful essay Literature and Revolution, Trotsky had spoken lyrically of a future in which the average man will rise to the stature of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx, in which his very physique would become more supple, muscular, and harmonious, and had closed by saying that beyond these hills, new peaks will rise. Myself, I could understand that political and economic conditions could make people very much worse, as in the case of Nazism, say. But I had too much English empirical schooling to believe that material circumstances on their own could make people all that much better. And surely, to be a materialist in the first place entailed the acceptance of mankind as a primate species. Karl Marx himself had admired and even hoped to emulate Charles Darwin. Anyway, here was my chance at witnessing a laboratory experiment. Was Cuba producing a more selfless and exemplary human type? I shan't easily forget the reply I received from a very sweet, if slightly slow-spoken, Communist Party official. Yes, he said. In fact, the new man is being evolved in the town of San Andres. As soon as I heard this, I demanded to visit this utopian commune, as did many of my comrades, but the trip to San Andres was always somehow being postponed, while they ironed out the wrinkles in the new man, and one was forced to wonder why, in any case, it should only work in this particular isolated hamlet. As a consolation prize, perhaps, we were instead invited to see Fidel Castro speak in Santa Clara at a mass rally on the 26th of July, anniversary of the beginning of the revolution, in the very city that Che Guevara had personally wrested from the control of the old regime. Although Guevara's martyred cadaver had been displayed on televisions all around the world, looking more than slightly Christ-like in its defiant and bearded serenity, his actual resting place was, as with the Nazarene indeed, unknown. He had in fact been secretly buried by the CIA under the tarmac of a Bolivian airstrip, and after having his hands amputated for fingerprinting purposes. But this grisly detail was not to be uncovered, or the whole reliquary returned to Havana until the 1990s. Thus the yell that Che Guevara no ha muerte, Che Guevara lives, had a sort of resonance, just as the innumerable images of his living visage possessed an iconic potency. The Cuban leadership declared 1968 to be the year of the heroic guerrilla, and issued a call to all the schoolchildren in the country that they should live their lives como el Che, or in the manner of Guevara. It was the impossibility of following this directive that hit me first, even before the realization that the whole thing was borrowed from what Christians called the imitation of Christ. So there it was. Cuban socialism was too much like a boarding school in one way and too much like a church in another. Long lectures from the headmaster were another feature that the two setups had in common. That and a huge overemphasis on team games and competitive sports of every kind. I mustn't pretend that it wasn't somewhat thrilling to have a front row seat and see the young Fidel Castro step up to the microphone and begin to stroke his beard in that way he once had. But after the first couple of hours, and the first few standing ovations, I felt that I had begun to grasp the main points, and a couple of hours later I was about ready to go and look for a cold beer. This commodity was actually easily come by, and for free, and one cynic suggested to me that that's how so many of the audience had been recruited to the rally in the first place. What hit me even more in my midsection, though, was the astonishing availability of young hookers on the edge of the crowd. One of the claims of the Cuban Revolution was to have abolished prostitution, and though I had never personally believed this to be feasible, the withering away of the state being one thing, but the withering away of the penis quite another, the whore scene in Santa Clara was many times more lurid than anything to be imagined in a bourgeois society. The same thing went, by the way, for the regime's much more arrogant and nasty claim to have done away with that other bourgeois vice of homosexuality. In such working public lavatories as one could find, the slogan "Libertad por los maricons," freedom for gays, was frequently chalked or scrawled, to show that the Cuban gays were by no means willing to concur in their own abolition. As the macro address by the maximum leader showed signs of drawing to a close, the crowd began to disintegrate into its individual constituents of people hurrying home. The red-scarf militants near the platform kept up a steady volley of cheers, but the masses were calling it a day. There was a distinct impression that more and better material incentives were what many workers and peasants would appreciate. I won't claim that I saw this all at once, and another part of me was still with the zealous Cubans who wanted to make sacrifices for Vietnam and Angola, and who didn't want a life of ease. These and other reflections inevitably raised the question, as we never tired of putting it, of Czechoslovakia. The Cuban leadership took no decided view on the increasingly public quarrel between Prague and Moscow. The Cuban Communist Party paper, Granma, later to be described by my Argentine anti-fascist friend Jacobo Timmerman as a degradation of the act of reading, was then printing the communiques from both communist capitals. This neutrality was not at all shared by the Cuban in the street, as I was to find out. Perhaps it had something to do with the natural bias in favour of a small country as against a superpower. Equally probably, as I was told, it had to do with the arrogant conduct of the many Russian advisers in Cuba. Certainly when you've had your European features greeted by little showers of pebble and dog shit, and the taunt "Sovietico" from the street urchins of Havana, you've been granted a glimpse or a hint of that very useful thing, an unscripted public opinion. Moreover, the Czech crew of the charter plane that brought me to Cuba had issued an invitation. When we go back, they said, we stop in London to drop you off, and we're not allowed to pick up any passengers. In other words, we fly on to Prague with an empty plane. If you care to stay on board, we can show you socialism with a human face for no extra charge. I had instantly signed on for this marvellous opportunity. Reporting to the Czechoslovak Airlines office in Havana to reconfirm my ticket, I found that the Czechs and Slovaks of the city had mounted their own demonstration on La Rampa, the city's main drag, and had been greeted by enthusiastic applause from average citizens on the sidewalk, another unfakeable test of popular emotion. Back in the camp, though, it seemed hard to imagine that party-mindedness would not emerge as the eventual victor. I can remember exactly how I came to realize this. Cuba was famous for its celebration of cinema and its lionization of its revolutionary directors like Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, the great Titon, even if his best-known marquee title, Memories of Underdevelopment, was perhaps only rivaled in sheer balls-aching tedium of nomenclature by the Czechoslovak masterpiece, Closely Watched Trains. Almost every night we could sit on a hillside and watch dramatic movies projected onto a huge open-air screen. On one tense and humid evening I watched Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers, completely unaware, as were many first-time viewers, that the harsh, grainy sequences of street fighting were not taken from a documentary, and near intoxicated, despite my supposedly better ideological training, by the visceral, sordid romance of the urban guerrilla. When it was over, I sat around, part hypnotized by the raw seduction of violence, until they showed it again. Several of the people I met in the Campamento Cinco de Mayo later showed up in the dock in Europe as members of the Angry Brigade, the Red Brigade, and kindred nihilist organizations. One of them I had known quite well. I attended his trial at the Old Bailey in the early 1970s, and as an early Angry Brigade communiqué was read out by the prosecuting counsel, suddenly realized that it was almost word for word what I had heard young Kit actually saying under the palms of Pinar del Rio. At all events, to the camp one day, for a seminar on film and revolution, was brought the legendary Cuban director Santiago Alvarez. I had seen some of his stuff and been more impressed by its pace and colour than I should have been. I knew perfectly well that the hideous President Johnson had not ordered the murders of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, but in that frenzied year it was exciting to see a piece of throbbing filmic propaganda called LBJ, the letters standing for Luther, Bobby and Jack, even though the order was weirdly wrong there, which blamed him for all three, and which additionally boasted a piercing soundtrack, with the magnificent defiant wailings of Miriam Makeba, wife of the crazed but charismatic incendiary Stokely Carmichael. For all this lurid lapse into infantile pre-Oliver Stone leftism, old Alvarez then gave a reasonable enough talk, and so I put up my hand and asked him a question. How did he find it as an artist to be working in Cuba, a state that had official policies on the aesthetic? Alvarez had obviously expected something like this and replied that artistic and intellectual liberty was untrammeled. Were there, I inquired, no exceptions to this? Well, he said, almost laughing at the naivete of my question, it would not, of course, be possible or desirable to attempt any satires or attacks on the leader of the revolution himself. But otherwise, the freedom of conscience and creativity was absolute. I do not know if what I next said came from the left or right part of my brain, but I like to think I anticipated at least some of the huge cultural and literary defection that later cost Castro the allegiance of writers as diverse as Carlos Franqui, Herberto Padilla, Jorge Edwards, and many others. I made the mere observation that if the most salient figure in the state and society was immune from critical comment, then all the rest was detail. Please never forget how useful the obvious can be, and how right it is that the image of the undraped emperor is such a keystone of our folklore. I don't think I've ever been so richly rewarded merely for saying the self-evident. There was quite an atmosphere until after Alvarez, whose reply, if any, I don't remember, had left, and then this atmosphere persisted while I took my metal tray and lined up in the dining hall. When I pretended to ask what was up, one of the Scottish comrades informed me, "The Cuban brothers thought what you said and did was so obviously counter-revolutionary." I was both annoyed and delighted by this obloquy. I certainly considered myself a revolutionary, and would warmly have contested the right of anybody to deny me the title, but there was also the sheer pleasure of seeing cliché in action, almost as if one had been called an enemy of the people, or a capitalist hyena, or, back to school again, someone who had let the whole side down. You do not forget, even if you come from a free and humorous society, the first time that you are, with unsmiling seriousness, called a counter-revolutionary to your face. It cannot have been many mornings later when I was shaken awake and told, "Get up, and get up now. The Russians have invaded Czechoslovakia." The person who was doing the shaking had bet me a trifling sum that this outcome would not occur, so it was nice of her to bring me the news of her own loss. I had already felt, in the course of the annus mirabilis of 1968, the sensation of being somehow involved in a historical moment or conjuncture, but at that instant in Cuba, I think I could have been forgiven the self-dramatization. For one thing, and merely because of the time zone, the terrible news from Eastern Europe came to us quite early in the morning, and, as I have said, the Castro leadership had as yet taken no public position on what was still an inter-communist quarrel. It was announced that Fidel would speak that night and give the line. I was quite sure that I knew what he was going to say, and indeed was frivolous enough to make a few more wagers on the side. But meanwhile, one was in the almost unique position of being in a communist state where for a whole day there was no official position on the most important item of international news. I was in Havana itself by then, because it was almost time to catch the chartered plane home, or, in my case, to Prague. The Red Army's first action had been to seize and immobilize the main airports of Czechoslovakia, so our plane hadn't even been able to leave its base. I remember going to the campus of Havana University, where there were a surprising number of students willing to denounce the Russian action, without looking over their shoulders or lowering their voices. All dissent had to be couched in communist terms, so you heard it said that Che would never have supported such big power bullying. This I then half believed but now doubt. The Chinese leadership in Beijing had lost no time in denouncing Soviet social imperialism, and there was a demonstration outside the Chinese embassy in support of this position, with people wearing little badges of Mao. I was told by somebody that if you went to call on the Chinese, They would ply you with cocktails and cigarettes while they explained their position. So I posed as an internationalist visitor and found the story to be true. The exquisite cigarettes, I remember, had the name Double Happiness. The politics weren't so sublime. A tiny diplomatic bureaucrat explained that China had been the first to call for Russian intervention in Hungary to stop counter-revolution in 1956, so had every right to denounce the latest move as counter-revolutionary in turn. The logic of this didn't seem exactly beautiful, and there was that unsettling term again. At lunchtime came the news that Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese communists had supported the Russians. This was enough to sway quite a number of Cubans. Then dusk began to draw in and the population mustered around the TV sets. I forget now where I watched the lengthy tirade in which Fidel Castro ended all utopian babble about Cuba following a different course from the sclerotic Stalinists in the Kremlin, but I think it was in the same pink-facaded Hotel Nacional where Graham Greene's sadistic Captain Segura once received a cold blast of soda water in the face and shouted "Coño!" before he could stop himself. As the speech of the bearded one wore on, the faces of some of my comrades began to take on a startled and upset cold shower look as well. And by the end of it, as the routine standing ovation of the Central Committee was being shown, the argument in our ranks was already underway. Apart from those few who stubbornly thought that Castro had done and said the right thing by taking the Brezhnev line, the main division was between those who thought he'd acted under duress and those who felt he was expressing his real ideological kinship. I thought it could well be both. It was obvious that Cuban communism depended upon Soviet oil and weapons to survive. But even had this not been so, Castro in his speech had been frigidly unsympathetic to the desire of the Czechoslovaks to live a life that was more open to the market economy, more attuned to the culture of the United States, and more adapted to the open societies of Eastern Europe. Once more making the stern attempt to be dialectical about this, I think I concluded without actually admitting it to myself that Castroism might still have a point in Latin America and the Caribbean, where monstrously reactionary dictatorships like those of Brazil and Nicaragua and Haiti were still undergirded by cynical American power. However, in more advanced Europe, the impulses of a revolutionary left could and should be used to erode the Berlin Wall from both sides. There were a number of brave Trotskyists among the Czech resistance, after all, led by the heroic Peter Uhl. Anyway, I do not completely hate myself for attempting this book balancing. And I can say with some pride that our small international socialist contingent in Havana managed to receive a rolled-up tube of a special edition of Socialist Worker from London by way of the mail, and that this edition was headed in big, bold black capitals, "Russians get out of Czechoslovakia." To have handed this out in Cuba during a world crisis was for me a matter of socialist honour, and gave me an irrepressible sense of participating in a genuinely historic moment. It seemed so clear that the ossified, torpid communist systems and parties had committed a kind of political and moral suicide by their Panzerkommunismus, Ernst Fischer's acid phrase, conduct in Prague, yet this seemed to offer a chance that in France, in Poland and Czechoslovakia, and in the yet-to-be liberated territories of the Third World, the brave 68 were clearing the way for a real and authentic left to emerge at last. The long-delayed Czech charter flight almost failed to clear the palm trees at the fringe of Havana Airport, something to do with a wrong guess about the weight of the luggage, but the expressions of the crew conveyed a generally listless attitude. They were returning to a country where the state-decreed slogan was that of post-invasion normalization, one of the most casually ugly phrases of the whole 20th century. Once again we had a stopover in Canada, and on the TV screens saw the Chicago police beating puddles of blood out of the demonstrators who were willing to pit themselves against a filthy war, a racist Democratic Party machine, and a fixed convention. Damn it, I remember thinking. I have missed Prague, and now I'm missing Chicago. Tourist of the Revolution was a phrase that was later used to ridicule those who went in search of socialist fatherlands. But I truly did not think of myself as a tourist. I simply and exhaustingly and fervently wished I could be in many places at once, so as to lean the uttermost of my slight weight onto the fulcrum. It was years later that I read Thomas Paine saying that to have played a part in 2 revolutions was to have lived to some purpose. This was the sort of eloquence that I wish I could have commanded at the time. However, I was still somewhat imprisoned within the jargon of left sectarianism. By the time our plane had landed in London, with the Czechs continuing morosely homeward, and I myself being subjected to yet another police scrutiny of my passport and my person, the new post-Chicago headline of Socialist Worker read like this: East and West, tanks and cops defend freedom. To a point, I approved this moral equivalence. It was, at any rate, better than those who only moaned painlessly about Prague, which the West had not defended, or those who were moved only to protest about Vietnam. The verbal crudeness of the headline's phrasing bothered me less than it should have done. After all, as our plane had neared London, we had been told that one of our number might possibly be detained and even deported upon arrival. He was a South African exile. Nothing more needed to be said. We all knew that we would form a cluster around him, pile our luggage into the shape of a barricade, raise our fists and utter the most obvious chants of resistance until we could be sure that a proper left-wing lawyer had arrived. The risk of our own detention or blacklisting would have been nothing more than the payment of a duty. Had you then accused me of being sloganistic in my politics, I would have considered it no great insult. As 1968 began to ebb into 1969, however, and as anticlimax began to become a real word in my lexicon, another term began to obtrude itself. People began to intone the words, "the personal is political." At the instant I first heard this deadly expression, I knew, as one does, from the utterance of any sinister bullshit, that it was, cliché is arguably forgivable here, very bad news. From now on, it would be enough to be a member of a sex or gender or epidermal subdivision, or even erotic preference, to qualify as a revolutionary. In order to begin a speech or to ask a question from the floor, all that would be necessary by way of preface would be the words "speaking as a." Then could follow any self-loving description. I will have to say this much for the old hard left: we earned our claim to speak and intervene by right of experience and sacrifice and work. It would never have done for any of us to stand up and say that our sex or sexuality or pigmentation or disability were qualifications in themselves. There are many ways of dating the moment when the left lost, or I would prefer to say discarded, its moral advantage, but this was the first time that I was to see the sellout conducted so cheaply. Back in Oxford, I ran into the warden in the High Street. He was very much his usual self, bustling and brimming and half deferential, half ironic. "My dear Christopher, just the man I wanted to tell. We have a new fellow coming to the college, a new recruit, as you'd probably say, but a hero, absolute hero. Bit of a Marxist, I'm afraid, but it can't be helped. You must meet him." This was my introduction to Leszek Kolakowski, who was then not much known outside his native Poland. He had been one of the reform communist intellectuals of the Polish Spring of 1956, a moment that had inaugurated a period of relative openness under the Gomulka regime. The reactionary and anti-Jewish crackdown of 1968, presaged by the arrest and imprisonment of Kuron and Modzelewski, had put all this into reverse. Kolakowski had, like so many of the intellectual leadership of Eastern Europe, been partly deported and partly self-exiled. He had at first gone to teach philosophy at the University of California at Berkeley, a campus whose name was near sacred to those of us who felt we were breathing the pure air of the 60s, but had evidently tired of this already and was willing to come to All Souls. While at Berkeley, he'd been handed a pamphlet that spoke of the contents of the university's library system as so much useless white knowledge. This had somewhat put him off the New Left in its then Bay Area form, where I assure you it can still be met with. Kolakowski had missed his formal education because of the Nazi occupation of his country, but had more than made up for it by the hungry ingestion of books during the wartime underground years, during which time he had also become a consecrated communist. When we eventually met, I was first of all and perhaps rather foolishly impressed by how exactly he looked his part. Victor Laszlo in Casablanca simply seems too sleek and well-fed to have been a survivor of Nazi penal institutions. I still shudder when I think how nearly Ronald Reagan came to being cast as Rick in that movie. But Leszek had the ideally gaunt, austere appearance of the dissident, who has known what it is to suffer material as well as intellectual deprivation. I was later to find that as a youth he had contracted tuberculosis of the bones. His voice and manner also were appropriately ironic and sardonic, and he had, in effect, seen all the way through communism. In my boyish way I thought I had done the same, but, and I cannot tell you how much this argument used to matter, I would not concede that Leninism and Stalinism were the same thing, or that the second logically followed from the first. After much wrestling and juggling, Kolakowski had simply given up on the whole idea of reform communism, or was at any rate in the throes of doing so. I did not believe that Stalin's system could be reformed, but I was quite convinced that it could and would only be overturned by and from the left. Kolakowski was quite patient with me. At the time, and how embarrassing I now find it to say this, I thought that it was I who was being quite indulgent to him. The Polish ambassador to London, a doltish apparatchik named Marian Dobroszewski, was invited to Oxford to give a talk, with the help of some Polish leftist friends, to act as translators for the Polish press on file at St. Antony's College. I managed to draft and print a leaflet in Polish and English, telling the Stalinist envoy that he was not welcome. I asked Kolakowski if he'd come to the event and help to swell our protest. He declined, saying rather dryly that there was little point in such commonplace encounters. We went ahead anyway and gave Ambassador Dobroszewski quite a bad time, and just as the evening was breaking up I saw a bony and quizzical visage peering from a dark corner at the very back of the hall. Leszek had not, after all, been able to resist showing up. At the time I thought that this was a small triumph for Trotskyism over mere anti-communism. In fact, Kolakowski was just beginning to erect the edifice of his astonishing trilogy, Main Currents of Marxism. I was fabulously lucky in having met him so early, but much too callow and overconfident to take full advantage of the chance I'd been given. Still, for almost the next 2 decades of my life, I carried on an argument with him and others like him about the nature of communism. Yes, the germ of Stalinism had been in Leninism to begin with, but had there not been other germs as well? And what historical conditions led to the dominance of which germs? I suppose I still hope to show that not everything about this debate was a complete waste of time. The remainder of my golden Oxford years slid by in this way, and though I was very oppressed at the time by a sense of waste, what my fellow Balliol man Anthony Pohl had called the crushing melancholy of the undergraduate condition, I do not believe that they were entirely squandered either. Let us say 1/4 of the time allotted to political confrontations and dramas, another devoted to reading books on any subject except the ones I was supposed to be studying, another 1/4 on seeking out intellectual heavyweights who commanded artillery superior to my own, with the residual 25% being consumed by the polymorphous perverse. It could have been worse. I made a minor discovery, which has been useful to me since in the analysis of some larger public figures like my contemporary Bill Clinton. If you can give a decent speech in public or cut any kind of figure on the podium, then you need never dine or sleep alone. I was actually a bit more confident on the platform than I was in the sack, and I can remember losing my virginity, a bit later than most of my peers, I suspect, with a girl who, inviting me to tea at one of the then segregated female colleges, allowed me to notice that her walls were covered with photographs taken of me by an unseen cameraman who'd followed my public career. Since apparently I could do no wrong with this young lady. There came also a day when the undergraduate weekly Charwell asked me if I would like to help write the John Evelyn gossip column. This was a prestige spot, disapproved of by some of my grimmer and less hedonistic comrades, but a perfect finesse of that problem offered itself at once. I was to be co-author of the column with Patrick Cockburn, whose father Claude, a red veteran of the Spanish Civil War, had been one of the great guerrilla journalists of all time. Had been. In the London offices of the great satirical magazine Private Eye, he still was a figure of immense authority. His oldest son Alexander had left Oxford to become one of the editors of the New Left Review, and his middle son, Andrew, an arrestingly handsome boy with a look reminiscent of the young T.S. Eliot, was another of my contemporaries. Anybody who knows anything about the later history of radical journalism will recognize these names, as they will that of the great documentary maker Christo Hurd, who became the third member of our John Evelyn team and helped us transform it from a mere chronicle of idle and gilded youth into something more mordant and investigative and Swiftian, or so we like to think. Once again, that lure of printer's ink and the word pamphleteer. I had better confess before quitting this to a having-it-both-ways moment that gave me even at the time a twinge of remorse. When Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger circumvented Congress and the Constitution and the strategic majority of Nixon's own cabinet in 1970 in order to conduct the invasion of Cambodia, I had already been invited to debate with the then Foreign Secretary Michael Stewart at the Oxford Union on the morality of the war in Indochina. The obscene images of the conflict, as they were extended to yet another country, were so enraging that I banished all thoughts of scruple. I accepted the formal invitation to take part in the debate and to attend the dinner beforehand with the Foreign Secretary. Meanwhile, I intrigued with friends to make sure that there was a large claque of hardcore protesters stationed in the main hall and in the gallery. I made my speech from the dispatch box in the approved manner. It wasn't one of my best, but it made a fairly fierce and detailed case against the imperial incursion, and then loudly insulted the government's guest of honour, deserted the other guests, and went to sit with and shout with the mob. At a given signal when Stewart rose to speak, the phalanx also rose and simply and repetitively yelled the one word "murderer" in his face. It was horribly gratifying to see the way in which such a leading member of Her Majesty's government turned so pale under the assault. At another signal, a noose was uncurled from the gallery and fell dangling within inches of the wretched Foreign Secretary's head. It was dropped by James Long, later to be a distinguished economics editor at the BBC. Nobody had ever attempted to abort a debate in these precincts before, and so the pitifully weak staff of the building was at a loss. We could have done almost anything we wanted, including at least roughing up, if not lynching, the Foreign Secretary. A sudden consciousness of exactly this ability, both intoxicating and nauseating, is probably what stalled us. We contented ourselves with further deafening insults and marched away. The official minute book of our little parliament still records that, for the first time in the 147 years of the Society's existence, the House voted to stand adjourned sine die on account of riot. The publicity was astounding. An editorial in the Times opined that our movement of protest was one of the nastiest political phenomena that Britain has experienced in this century, which I thought, when one considered only a few of the other phenomena, was plainly absurd. We had, in our own opinion, not silenced Mr. Stewart, whose views were well known and could easily be broadcast, so much as we had voiced the outrage that should properly be felt at the destruction of Cambodian society. I remember arguing with dexterous casuistry that we had compelled the establishment press to take notice and had thus, in a way, actually succeeded in enlarging the area of free speech. A nice try, I hope you will admit. But however one phrased the case, the only reason for mentioning free speech in the first place was that, however one looked at it, we had in fact shut down a public debate by force. I had a huge quarrel about it with Jack Straw, then the head of the National Union of Students and a strong opponent of the Vietnam War, who insisted that the right of free expression trumped all other considerations. It was years before we agreed on anything again, and by that time he was himself the Foreign Secretary for Tony Blair, and arguing at the United Nations for the removal of the intolerable Saddam Hussein tyranny from Iraq. I remember how we arrived at a higher synthesis, a final justification for our breach of the rules of civility, debate, and hospitality. After all, we had, did we not, a higher cause and a nobler purpose. It was even possible, given the huge media fuss generated by our action, that the people of Indochina would get to hear of it, and as a result take additional heart from the knowledge of our solidarity. As I write this, I realize that I then truly did believe it. After a mighty demonstration outside the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, Michael Rosen had written a haunting poem, published in the university's literary magazine Isis, that hymned a then-famous poster of a Vietnamese woman in a paddy field with a gun slung over her shoulder. Please let it be, the poem had urged, that some of the news and pictures of our revolt will reach you and put a smile on your face. Next to this imperative, we felt, all lesser reservations were merely pallid and insipid. So, quite hardened as I was to insisting on this point against those who were more tentative, why was it that I could not quite repress the sense of having done something shabby? I have something to expiate, as D.H. Lawrence put it in his poem Snake, a pettiness.